the Queen gave great pride to our nation. She managed to cope with all the extraordinary pressures and the microscope that's on her, always managing to hit the right note at the right time.
The Queen had dignity, dedication to duty, that steel vision, that kind of empathy with other people.
My goodness, what a very special lady we were privileged to have. She was a force for good. She really was a force for good. And the world's a lesser place without her in it.
When Princess Elizabeth became Queen in 1952, Britain was a very different place. During her long reign, we experienced radical social, political and technological change. Yet through it all, Queen Elizabeth kept calm and carried on. A reassuring presence through one of the most extraordinary periods of our history. This is the story of the Queen and us. The 70s was the decade where the Queen reached out to her people. In the Commonwealth and back home, getting closer to us than ever before. It may have been a time of political turmoil, as strikes and power cuts crippled the country, and terrorism struck at the heart of the nation. But despite our problems, for the Queen and for us, it proved one of the happiest decades of her reign.
The Royal Yacht Britannia steams into Wellington Harbour, bringing the Queen, the Duke of Edinburgh and Princess Anne to New Zealand. The Prince of Wales was to join them that evening.
In 1970, the Queen travelled to New Zealand and Australia as part of a Commonwealth tour to commemorate Captain Cook's journey of discovery 200 years earlier. Their visit began with typical pomp and ceremony.
The Canberra jets of the Royal New Zealand Air Force flew overhead in salute.
But there was something completely new about this trip.
It has been a different kind of tour, with a new style, meet the people informality.
In a break with royal protocol, the family mingled with the huge crowds. Reporters drew on Indigenous culture to coin a phrase that captured this new informality. The walkabout. The walkabout set a change in tone for the coming decade. The Queen would be far more accessible to her people. And back home, change was pretty much all we talked about. In 1971, a new portrait of the Queen was being stamped onto billions of coins. The old pounds, shillings and pennies were consigned to history as our money went decimal. For centuries, there'd been 240 pennies in a pound. Now there'd be just 100 pence. But for some, it was a sign that cherished British tradition was being eroded.
My mum was furious. Let it go down in history. When she went shopping, she refused to deal in decimalised coins. She'd hold out the money and say, I don't want to know how much it is in that awful money, just take what you need.
These are the 10-penny coins. This is the 2-penny coin.
Many older people struggled to adjust.
I didn't find it terribly easy.
How are you getting on with the new coins?
Well, it's just terrible.
I was working in the West Country. Older people said, oh, not sure about this here decimalisation. I don't understand it. But the kids all said, yeah, great, because of course they were doing decimalisation in schools. And so the kids took to it, of course, like that.
I remember we used to profiteer off of the older people. They couldn't quite get the grasp of how much this was worth compared to that. So we used to change coins with adults. We go around scouring anywhere to find old pennies and halfpennies. People caught on pretty quick, you know, once they started realising what crooks we were.
She's my woman of gold and she's not very old, She's my woman of gold.
In this new money, a typical annual salary was around £2,500. It doesn't sound like much now, but in the 70s it went a long way. A pint of beer cost just 15p. And back then, many of us believed we had jobs for life. Around half of us were members of trade unions, often employed in traditional industries, such as mining, steel and shipbuilding. In the summer of '71, the Queen visited the historic Vickers shipyard at Barrow-in-Furness to launch the most advanced destroyer in her naval fleet.
I name this ship Sheffield. May God bless her and all who serve in her.
HMS Sheffield was a feat of British engineering. So too was the supersonic jet that the Duke of Edinburgh boarded 6 months later. Concorde, co-developed with the French, would become one of the world's most iconic planes. It travelled at almost twice the speed of sound, and on this test flight, the Duke was given the controls. Concorde was a symbol of British achievement. And back on the ground, we were feeling pretty pleased with our lot too. In the 1970s, a Gallup survey reported we were amongst the happiest people in the world. We were earning more, working less, and living longer than ever before during the Queen's reign. Yet our sense of well-being would soon be threatened. In February 1972, the Irish Republican Army attacked a British military base in Aldershot.
How far away from the bomb blast were you?
I was 200 yards away in the block of offices just over there.
The IRA's campaign of terror had spread from Northern Ireland to the British mainland. And almost no target was off limits. A bomb would explode inside the Houses of Parliament. And police uncovered plans to attack Buckingham Palace.
You were worried every time you went shopping in any town, any village, any city, because the bombings seemed to be indiscriminate. You didn't know when they were coming, you didn't know where they were coming. It was a terribly, terribly depressing time because you wanted it to be solved, this seemingly insoluble problem.
The IRA described the bombings as retaliatory actions for what happened in January 1972, when British troops fired upon a crowd at a civil rights rally in Londonderry. Rubber bullets were initially used, then live ammunition. Bloody Sunday, as it became known, left 14 unarmed civilians dead. Its legacy was a tragic increase in sectarian violence, as the Troubles became an almost daily occurrence.
I was actually broadcasting in the 70s when a car bomb went off at the base of the studio wall, and I was on air live. They had evacuated the building, but I opted to stay. Life went on, and people fought that attitude against terrorism about it's not going to affect my life. I'm not going to let it stop me doing things.
For the Queen, carrying on as normal meant keeping to her busy schedule. And in 1972, as people queued around the block at London's British Museum, she had a sneak preview of an extraordinary exhibition, The Treasures of Tutankhamun, an ancient Egyptian king.
I have great pleasure in declaring open this exhibition in the confidence that countless people from all over the world will visit and enjoy the treasures of Tutankhamun while they are with us.
The 3,000-year-old pharaoh's tomb had been discovered by British archaeologists 50 years earlier. And over 1.5 million of us flocked to see the treasures, waiting up to 8 hours to secure a ticket. Opening the exhibition was one of several hundred engagements the Queen carried out that year.
And Her Majesty the Queen, the patron of the Football Association.
In May, she was invited to Wembley for the centennial FA Cup final. Arsenal were the defending champions, and Leeds were flying high in the league. Unlike today, there were no international players in the North-South clash. English clubs couldn't buy players from abroad until the rules changed at the end of the decade.
Trying to take on McNabb outside, he's round the back.
A second-half goal from Leeds settled this historic match.
And so, at last, Leeds have got what they've deserved, a major trophy.
Ten days later, the Queen's diary took her on a state visit to France, where she took time out to see her critically ill uncle, the Duke of Windsor, the former King Edward VIII, at his home in Paris. In 1936, he'd abdicated to marry American divorcee Wallis Simpson, forcing the Queen's father to become king and shaking the monarchy and Britain to its roots. Now cameras captured the moment the Queen shook hands with the woman widely blamed for the constitutional crisis. The former king was bedridden, too ill to join them, and just 10 days later, he died. The Duke's body was returned to Windsor, where it lay in state. It was a very public display of forgiveness, which we echoed.
2,000 people an hour came to pay their respects. They literally queued miles and waited hours for the man they all loved.
The abdication crisis had divided the royal family and the nation for decades. Now that chapter of our history was finally closed.
The Queen has been a great calming influence. All the turmoil goes around her, and she seems to be in the calm of it all. No, quite extraordinary.
That summer, the cost of an average family home hit a record high, £6,500. Around half of us still rented, but many aspire to own a home of our own.
You know, when you do tell people you've got your own house, then, you know, it's a status symbol, you know, you just feel nice, you know.
But supply couldn't keep up with demand, forcing prices up. And prospective buyers were driven to extreme measures to try to secure a home.
For 7 days and nights, the people who desperately wanted a home of their own queued patiently in their cars outside the Brookview estate, Luton. Some of them had taken their annual holiday in order to join the queue.
There she is.
That longing to get on the property ladder was reflected in the comedy Whatever Happened to the Likely Lads. Working class Bob has brought a brand new home.
There's not much privacy, is there?
Privacy? Compared to what we were brought up in, this is Woburn Abbey. You think the houses we lived in as kids, if you sneezed, they said, bless you next door.
Balmoral affords recreation as well as relaxation. Hunting, shooting and fishing. There's trout in the streams nearby and salmon at the right time of the year.
Even the Queen would get swept up in the excitement. For many years, she'd been leasing some land on a country estate, not far from her Scottish home, Balmoral. But with prices rising so fast, she, like everyone else, felt it was time to stop renting and buy.
When we got married, we bought a tiny little end of terrace cottage. A, because we could afford it, B, also it had a garden. An Englishman's home is his castle, however tiny it was. And this little end of terrace house was tiny. We had some friends came round and she walked in the front door and said, "Oh, goodness, I didn't know they made houses this small."
Despite more people owning their homes, for some, living conditions were still basic. Only 1 in 4 homes had central heating, and 1 in 10 still used an outside toilet. There was plenty of room for improvement.
How about giving your home a new look? There's no time like the present for a coat of paint or a change of interior decor.
As home ownership increased, so did our enthusiasm for DIY.
It was independence for the first time. That freedom of having your own house to paint the walls whatever colour you wanted. The dining room was dark brown, and the front room was a shocking shade of green. It was wonderful.
I got myself a brand new DIY book. I ripped up the carpets, man. And I got this old sander. And I spent hours sanding up and down, and when it finished, polishing it. Loved it. And it looked fantastic.
Our spruced up homes were filling up with the latest mod cons too. In a sign of technological progress, 1 in 3 families now had their own landline.
The next thing to do is to choose the style and colour. What a range!
I remember us having our very first telephone. The telecoms engineer turned up and he asked me what colour telephone we wanted. And my mother said, right, a black or a white one. So we ended up with a bright red one. Being a Man United fan, I had to have a red phone for Manchester United and Wales. And my mother was furious.
Buoyed by easier credit and rising wages, Britain was enjoying a consumer boom. Yet despite the remarkable pace of change, some things were, reassuringly, still the same. In November 1972, the Queen and Prince Philip celebrated 25 years of marriage.
So begins the happy progress from Palace to London's 15th century Guildhall.
Tens of thousands of us lined the route, including many schoolchildren who'd been given the day off.
Her Majesty the Queen, Duke of Edinburgh, arrive in the City of London.
At a banquet to mark their silver wedding anniversary, the Queen spoke fondly of her married life.
I think everybody really will concede that on this, of all days, I should begin my speech with the words, my husband and I. We, and by that I mean both of us, are most grateful.
What the Queen demonstrated was a constancy. Whatever she picked up from her parents in terms of duty and position, she maintained, and she passed it on to her children.
If I am asked today what I think about family life after 25 years of marriage, I can answer with equal simplicity and conviction. I am for it.
After lunch, the crowds were treated to London's first royal walkabout.
The Queen and Prince Philip move out among the people. People who've waited for a long time for the chance of not only seeing the Queen, but actually talking to her on her silver wedding day.
In the 70s, most of us got married before our 25th birthdays. And the Queen's only daughter was no exception. 23-year-old Princess Anne would marry Captain Mark Phillips in 1973. It was the fairy tale wedding of the decade. And thanks to the latest advances in colour TV, it would be the first time most of us got to see a royal wedding in all its glory.
50 cameras will be used to cover every part of the procession and ceremony. It's been estimated that there'll be 500 million people watching the solemn moment when Princess Anne and Captain Phillips are married.
TV ownership had soared during the Queen's reign. More than 9 out of 10 living rooms now boasted a set.
The TV was brown, sort of faux wood, nice. And down one side, plastic heavy buttons. Well, sometimes you get stuck between BBC One and 2, and then you'd have to try and press 3 to unplug. And then there's a lot of banging of the side of the box as well.
We'd become, one paper reported, an armchair nation, enjoying events from the comfort of our front rooms.
It's like a friend, it really is. Sort of a warm, cosy friend in the front room that you switch on when you want some company.
That November, half the population tuned in to watch the royal wedding.
The bride's procession proceeds along the Mall.
I was working at Kew. I remember going into the treasurer's office where you went to get your wages, and they had a television in there. And we all leaned on this counter watching this little screen and going, oh.
That delicate moment arriving when the princess in her beautiful wedding dress will get out of this carriage. Not an easy operation. First time we see the bride in her dress of white pure silk. And very lovely she looks.
The cameras recorded the splendour and majesty as a proud Prince Philip led his daughter through Westminster Abbey.
I pronounce that they be man and wife together, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen.
And so the long walk to the great west door begins. Proud parents.
It was a joyful day for the Queen and a bank holiday for us to enjoy the wedding. But away from the celebrations, an ongoing dispute was about to become a crisis. Throughout the Queen's reign, Britain had relied on electricity from coal-fired power stations. So Britain's 300,000 miners held enormous political clout.
Grandfathers went down the mine, and fathers went down the mine, and their sons went down the mine. And whole areas, when you actually traveled around there, you realized how much that industry encompassed the lives of hundreds of thousands of people.
Now the miners demanded a pay rise, recognition for their dirty, dangerous work. So to put pressure on the government, they refused to work any overtime. Coal production plummeted. Conservative Prime Minister Edward Heath tried to resolve the miners' pay dispute. But in the middle of negotiations, Britain's fuel problem got worse. Conflict in the Middle East had led to a sharp rise in the price of petrol, causing severe shortages. Faced with an energy crisis, the government announced a state of emergency.
Industry needs power. At home, you could get by with less, so switch off some power. Now.
Edward Heath addressed the nation.
we are limiting the use of electricity by almost all factories, shops and offices to 3 days a week. In terms of comfort, we shall have a harder Christmas than we have known since the war.
Despite the crisis, the Queen carried on as normal and attended a church service in Windsor on Christmas Day. But while the royal family stuck to time-tested traditions, Britain was in the midst of the biggest crisis since the Second World War.
We are sorry, owing to labour difficulties, very few trains will leave from Waterloo tonight.
Train and bus services were severely disrupted. Streetlights were dimmed by 50%. Speed limits cut. But there was something typically British about the way we handled it all.
We were just as calm in the war when the bombs were falling round us. We're not going to panic.
The atmosphere was quite scary, in a sense, because you just didn't know what was going to happen. It was very volatile. But we were doing what we do best in this country, is just, toughing it out.
As coal and oil stocks dwindled, blackouts became commonplace.
Your gran would talk about the Blitz spirit, the good old days when they were in a bunker during the war, which was similar to the power cut times that just made us kids go, what are you talking about? Turn the lights back on.
I remember the electricity going off, but when you're a kid, that's exciting. When all the lights go out and you have to eat by candlelight, that's kind of like thrilling when you're a kid.
I wouldn't say that it was all bad, because it meant we didn't have TV. So we played board games and card games with our family. And we used to sit there, played Monopoly and Cluedo, and, we had all that going on. So it was great for all that.
With the telly going off, children sought more old-fashioned pleasures and embraced pedal power.
You'd go on really long bike rides, and your parents never asked you where you'd been or where you were going. But when it was time to come in for your tea, you knew. Because my mum would stand outside the gate and go, Len! And then, everybody went like deer in the veldt,
As the crisis dragged on, the Queen kept to her schedule, which took her on a tour to New Zealand and the Pacific Islands.
The Queen's arrival was the signal for a dramatic ritual challenge from a Maori leader. The rigmarole signifies friendship to the royal family.
She treated the Commonwealth very much as a family. She said those words in her coronation about devoting my life to the service of my country and to the Commonwealth, and that is precisely what she's done.
But while the Queen's tour went from strength to strength, back home, the news went from bad to worse. In February 1974, the miners voted for a nationwide strike and coal production ground to a halt. Popular sitcoms reflected this deepening crisis.
Whatever has happened to the central heating in here? My ballpoint will never function in this weather.
Anxiety had spread to the shop floor at TV's Grace Brothers.
I think it's warmer outside.
No, we shall all have to do what we can to combat this critical crisis. Does that mean we've got to go down the mines?
Faced by national emergency, Edward Heath took a political gamble. He informed the Queen, who was still on her Commonwealth tour, that he would call a snap election.
The Pacific Islands tour had been a big success, but it ran aground on the hard realities of the British election.
The Queen was forced to cut short her visit and head back to the UK for the outcome of the vote.
Early election results will be radioed to her plane as she flies back to Britain.
But those results came as a shock. Labour's Harold Wilson narrowly won, and he handed the miners an inflation-busting pay rise of over 30%. After a 10-week crisis, we could finally go back to work as normal. The 3-day week was over. The following year, the Queen visited a mine in Yorkshire, even taking the cage down to the coalface over 500 metres below the ground.
There's someone new on the morning shift at Silverwood Colliery. The Queen comes suitably dressed for the occasion.
Signs of industrial unrest seemed a distant memory. But despite appearances, our troubles were far from over. Government spending was slipping out of control. By the mid-70s, inflation was over 20%, and unemployment topped 1 million. Britain was considered the sick man of Europe. The economy was such a hot topic, it was even discussed by the fictional inmates of TV Slade prison.
Do you know this country is on the verge of economic ruin? This once great nation of ours is teetering on the brink of an abyss.
By the time you lot get out, there'll be nobody worth robbing.
The price of food rocketed and panic buying led to shortages. The days of boom had gone bust.
You've just been able to buy any sugar?
No, you can't get any sugar around here at all, no matter how much you try. You go in places and they say, we put sugar out today. Yeah, I think it's for special people only.
People panic, and people did. I remember bread shortages. Dear Lord, you go down the road and people coming up the road with like 24 loaves of bread. There's no bread today. Tomorrow there'll be some more. You know, you don't have to buy so much to the exclusion of everybody else.
The Queen, mindful that we were all feeling the pinch, made her own economies. On a state visit to Mexico in 1975, she broke with tradition and limited the number of new outfits she took. Last year's dresses would do, she said. And the trip proved a triumph.
It seems the Queen has met half the people in Mexico, and everywhere she's gone, they've been friendly, overwhelmingly friendly.
Back home, some of us, fed up with industrial unrest and a failing economy, packed up and left Britain.
And don't cry.
Heading off to start new lives in the Commonwealth.
I've lost an awful lot of faith in this country, so I have decided to put my house on the market, and we are going to emigrate to Canada.
Let's face it, years and years ago, we were one of the top nations in the world, and look at us now.
In fact, in the mid-70s, emigrants outnumbered immigrants. But for most of us, getting away for 2 weeks in the sun was enough. While traditional seaside holidays remained hugely popular, low-cost package holidays to the sunny Med were luring us abroad.
One holiday when I was 21, we went to Italy, to Lido di Jesolo. That's how they used to pronounce it in the East End. Lido di Jesolo, that's where we went, near Rimini.
In a sign of the times, Coronation Street jetted off to Mallorca. Proof that holidays in the sun weren't just for the middle classes.
Tell me something. You think I'm...
Yes, you're going brown.
Ta. I was going to say, do you think I'm going to be all right? My jeans and smock top for tonight.
Come in your nothings if you like. I don't think it matters at these places. Personally, I'm getting all tarted up.
While we enjoyed taking a break in Europe, not all of us were keen to be part of it. We had joined the European Economic Community, the EEC, on New Year's Day 1973. The Queen celebrated the occasion with the Prime Minister at the Royal Opera House and publicly backed our joining what she called a wider family of nations. But some feared Europe meant a loss of sovereignty and traditional freedoms.
There was always a wariness about Europe, a suspicion. But it was quite interesting to see those old historical grievances still acting themselves out.
So in 1975, at the Labour Party's insistence, Britain's first ever referendum was held to decide if we really wanted to stay in or get out.
All-night vigil under
One of the loudest pro-European voices was the new Conservative leader of the opposition, Margaret Thatcher.
working together for peace in Europe.
In the end, we voted 2-1 in favour of staying in. But 4 decades or so later, we would change our mind.
This country is now in one of the worst periods of drought since records began 200 years ago.
In the summer of '76, you didn't need to go abroad to get a tan. The sun had come to us. As some parts of Britain went 45 days without rain, reservoirs ran dry. It got so hot that forest fires broke out. Hose pipes were banned and water was strictly rationed.
I remember we used to fill the bath up with water before it shut off. Every pot was filled with water. So then you'd get a stand-up wash with bowls and whatever else, but you still had enough water to make a pot of tea or to boil food. And then if there was still water come the following morning, you had a bath before you went out of the house.
Some areas had their supply cut off completely. So standpipes were introduced, where we had to queue up in the street for water and carry it back home. But as we soaked up the sun, the Queen travelled to Montreal in Canada to formally open the 1976 Olympics.
Je proclame l'ouverture des Jeux olympiques de 1976.
Despite her many duties, the Queen wasn't just there to work. She'd also come as a proud mum.
The royal family posed for photographers the first time that the entire family had been together abroad.
Princess Anne was the first member of the royal family to compete at an Olympic Games. She rode her mother's horse, Goodwill, in the 3-day event, doing her bit for Britain and for British women.
There's nothing to stop a girl from getting a horse to do exactly the same thing as a man can. I was rather determined to either keep up with my brother or do the same things that he was doing.
But for most young women, such equality was a little slower in coming.
While the boys study metalwork or industrial skills, the girls are taught domestic science, a grander word for housework.
Traditionally, men had been the breadwinners, and at the start of the 70s, over 90% still earned more than their partners, and wives and mothers were still seen as the homemakers. But after years of putting up with second-class status, more women were demanding change.
I think women started to realise that they did have a voice. And that was the beginning of a big change of women wanting not to go back to being just the little woman at home.
The demands are for 24-hour nurseries, for equal pay now, equal job and education opportunities, and free contraception and abortion on demand under the National Health Service.
It was a very positive time. I was very keen to be independent, to make my own choices, to make my own career, to be equal.
Just over half of married women were now in work. Though most jobs were limited to those in schools, hospitals and factories. But things were improving. the introduction of an Equal Pay Act and a Sex Discrimination Act provided hope that equality wasn't so far away.
When I got married in the 70s, it didn't cross my mind that I'd stop working. I think there were so many chances for so many women, and girls thought, oh, actually, I could have a career.
As the family dynamic shifted, some men began to enthusiastically embrace the change.
No longer is housework and bringing up children regarded as exclusively a woman's responsibility.
The house husband was born.
I now see the homemaker's role as immensely rewarding, a tremendous job.
Keith is a much better mum than I am.
In 1977, the BBC launched a new motoring show, Top Gear.
There are a lot of bad drivers. Some of them are women, but an awful lot of them are men.
Motoring had long been the preserve of men. But now Angela Rippon was in the driving seat.
I was living in Devon, working in London. I was clocking up between 36 and 40,000 miles a year, just driving backwards and forwards. I had a ball doing it.
The number of women drivers was on the up. A decade earlier, only 1 in 10 women drove. Now, it was 1 in 3. The Queen herself had been a trailblazer. She'd first got behind the wheel aged 18, as a truck driver and mechanic during the Second World War.
Queen Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth, Silver Jubilee.
In 1977, the Queen celebrated 25 years on the throne. That May, she began a Silver Jubilee tour in Scotland, the start of 100 days of celebration.
She's not actually what I expected, but she's gorgeous.
Hundreds of thousands turned out to see the Queen as she greeted well-wishers on the streets of Glasgow.
My wish had been fulfilled. I always wanted to meet her in the flesh.
Before setting off on her Jubilee tour, she had spoken of her commitment to serve all her people.
I was crowned Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Perhaps this Jubilee is a time to remind ourselves of the benefits which union has conferred.
Despite the dangers, the Queen would even carry that message of unity to Northern Ireland, where the IRA had threatened to attack her.
It was holding up the flag. It was flying the flag for a united kingdom, of which she is the Queen. It is saying, I am here to support every one of you, regardless of your creed and your political affiliations. I am your Queen, and I am not going to be scared off.
While some complained that the Jubilee celebrations were too lavish in a time of economic difficulty, many of us disagreed.
One of the reasons she was so popular is that she made the effort to be seen and to be out and about and to shake people's hands. It crossed boundaries. That's a big deal.
Across the UK, communities came together to celebrate at thousands of street parties.
In the middle of the road, going right the way down it, were trestle tables with Union Jacks on. I've still got my mug. 1977. Still use it.
The joy and spontaneity surprised even the Queen. I am amazed, she reportedly said. I had no idea.
1977 was a year of hope. And I remember watching the Queen in that beautiful pink outfit with the pink hat. She knew how to dress to stand out in the crowd. She's got this wonderful smile on her face, this feeling of, who would have thought?
By the end of her Jubilee tour, the Queen had travelled 8,000 miles around Britain and kept 800 engagements. She shook so many hands, the Times reported, that she'd worn out 4 pairs of white gloves a day. The Jubilee celebrations inspired a new patriotic fervour.
Yes, she's done it!
Which was very much on show when Virginia Wade won Wimbledon in front of a record crowd, including the Queen.
In her Jubilee year, Her Majesty will present the trophy to a British winner.
The crowds that celebrated the Jubilee told us much about how the country was changing. Immigration from the Commonwealth was starting to transform the face of Britain, especially in our inner cities.
The Queen was very proud of being head of the Commonwealth. She wanted to make sure that everyone in the Commonwealth felt as if they belonged.
And that need to belong was certainly true of one exceptional group. Earlier in the decade, 60,000 Asians had been expelled from Uganda, a former British colony, by its dictator Idi Amin. The Queen, as head of the Commonwealth, described their treatment as deplorable. And the Duke of Edinburgh made a point of visiting one of the resettlement centres that had opened to welcome them to Britain. Thousands of families started new lives in the UK.
They've embraced the English way of life to the extent of taking over their own pubs, complete with Asian landlords.
But the immigration of Commonwealth citizens wasn't popular with everyone.
Well, they're strangers, absolute strangers in our own country now.
You're just a minority.
What does that make you feel like?
Well, you're just outnumbered.
We're nothing, are we?
You're just nothing. You just don't, you're not British anymore.
Love thy neighbour. I think we'll go welcome our new neighbours. We might as well get to know them. I bet they'll be glad to see a friendly face.
A new comedy series captured some of the tensions.
Hello, mate. Eddie Boone. Next door. Just that.
I'm not the one who's moving in here.
Who is moving in here, then?
Mr. Booth, I'm your new neighbour.
Bloody no. I know that sort.
Love Thy Neighbour told the story of a white suburban couple, Eddie and Joan Booth, and their new black neighbours, Bill and Barbara Reynolds.
You ought to hear what honkies sing.
The language of the day was extreme, and the show's writers pulled few punches.
Never hear anything. You realise it's only a question of time before we're polluted?
What are you on about now?
Them lot next door. They'll stink us out with curry.
Yes, it's of its time. It was written purely for entertainment. It was, in a way, to show the stupidity of racism.
Although Britain was becoming more multicultural, most of the country was still white. And that included the England football team. So when Nottingham Forest's Viv Anderson pulled on a Three Lions shirt in 1978, he became England's first black player.
Football was pretty much in the dark ages in the 70s. You know, I played in football matches where you used to see bananas thrown on the pitch regularly at black players, dreadful things like that.
And when we went to Everton, I was racially abused and attacked. Some guy ran out of the crowd and tried to headbutt me and tried to punch me and stuff. People would get a kicking, you know.
Then football grounds could be dangerous places for all supporters, as violence between rival fans escalated.
I remember going to Stoke, watching Leicester in the mid-70s. I was just chased down this street. I mean, these were like grown blokes, and I was like a kid. I mean, it was the most terrifying experience, but I was always quick. Thankfully, they gave up after a while, because the one thing I never had was stamina. I think I'd have been in trouble.
As hooliganism took hold of the national game, attendances fell. So families found other ways to occupy the weekends. In 1977, the Queen visited a multi-million-pound leisure complex in Northumberland.
Concordia Centre was officially opened by Her Majesty the Queen. Thousands turned out for a great day.
As a craze for keeping fit swept the nation, hundreds of leisure centres opened up. But if gymnastics proved a bit square for some, there were other ways to let your hair down. On the dance floor, young people had far greater freedom for self-expression than ever before.
I think it was an amazing time to be a teenager because youth culture gave you an alternative to kind of normal life. You know, things like David Bowie, Mark Bolan, Alice Cooper, all of those things were sort of slightly otherworldly and they weren't things that your parents would like. It was quite eclectic, I think, the 70s. You had punk rock, you had electro, and then you had hip hop. I mean, it was, and then you had disco as well going on at the same time.
They had these massively wide trousers that could house a family of four. And you had the pockets down here on the side, the high waistband. You wore a tank top that was usually stripy. And you wore a shirt with a collar so large you could land Concorde on it. And that's how we rolled.
My mum did buy me a pair of platform shoes. I did wear them to school and get sent home immediately.
While teenagers pushed the limits of fashion, the Queen's teenage son, 18-year-old Prince Andrew, was in a distinct uniform of his own.
Go! 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Prince Andrew's exit from the Hercules was good.
Following family tradition, he was training for the armed forces.
His landing was good too.
Prince Andrew, can you say how you felt about that jump?
Well, it's a feeling that I'd never wanted to miss.
As Prince Andrew leapt from the skies, that summer his parents enjoyed something a little more down to earth. In June 1978, the Queen and Prince Philip were special guests at the BBC for a recording of one of the decade's most popular sitcoms, The Good Life.
The Queen, in a finely pleated chiffon dress with ruffled sleeves and masses of little pink and white rosebuds.
We watched her on the monitor coming into the BBC, and out she came, Her Majesty, in a beautiful long evening dress with diamonds flashing. We got incredibly overexcited.
And incidentally, I gather this is the first situation comedy which the Queen has ever seen produced in a television studio.
The BBC was polished. Brass that had never shone for 100 years was shiny. New carpets were laid. Corridors were painted. Windows were cleaned. It was an extraordinary evening.
The Queen took her seat among the audience and settled in as the cast recorded the show.
Hello, Margot. Hello, Barbara. Hello, Margot. Hello, Tom.
Once again, comedy was commenting on society.
Thinking of? Oh, Tom, they're
Neighbours, the Goods and the Ledbetters couldn't have been more different.
Good morning.
Morning.
Tom and Barbara had dropped out of the rat race. While on the other side of the garden fence, capitalism ruled.
You had a couple who really believe in security and pensions and going up the social ladder successfully. And then you've got the Goods next door who don't have a social ladder of any kind. Their main concern is have the carrots grown. So it's two completely different lives in a way.
If I had my way, the profit motive would be a compulsory subject at school.
Oh, money, money, money. Oh, what are you going to live on when you get old, eh? Parsnips.
Money, money, money wasn't only on Margot's mind. It had become the biggest issue of the day. That November marked the start of the winter of discontent, as hundreds of thousands of workers went out on strike for better pay. And Britain almost came to a standstill.
If you were a member of a union, there was a solidity. There was solidarity. If you were a member of the public and affected by what the unions were doing, you hated the unions. There was always a them and us.
Promising to rein in the unions, Mrs. Thatcher, leader of the Conservative opposition, swept to power in the 1979 general election. In May, the Queen invited her to the palace, where she was appointed Britain's first female Prime Minister.
Where there is discord, may we bring harmony. Where there is error, may we bring truth. Where there is doubt, may we bring faith. And where there is despair, may we bring hope.
But such optimism was short-lived. That summer, the Queen's cousin, Lord Mountbatten, was assassinated by the IRA while on holiday in Ireland. It was an unprecedented attack on the royal family.
Procession will advance!
Lord Mountbatten was given a ceremonial funeral with full military honours.
And to the beat of drums, Admiral of the Fleet Earl Mountbatten of Burma's last parade begins.
Prince Charles had been particularly close to Mountbatten, and on hearing of his death, wrote of his agony, disbelief, a kind of wretched numbness.
When those people who want to do evil want to perpetrate it, then everybody's a target. It was a huge tragedy in a whole conflict of real sadness. Just a very dark period of British history.
Despite her terrible loss, the Queen would have to set her grief aside and carry on her traditional duties. That Christmas, she and Prince Charles welcomed thousands of children to a carol concert outside the palace. It was a chance to look forward to a new decade with the next generation. For some, the 80s would bring new wealth and new confidence. But for others, life would become increasingly troubled. But the Queen would remain as steady and reassuring as ever.
Mày có ai? Tao sợ quá ớt. Tao lại sợ quá hơn. Tao sợ quá ớt. Tao lại sợ quá hơn. Tao lại sợ quá hơn. Tao lại sợ quá hơn. Sợ quá hơn. Mày có ai? Ai?
for others, life would become increasingly troubled. But the Queen would remain as steady and reassuring as ever.